You're strong enough to make your own way, Alina. Your brother needs this more than you do." Those words echoed through the sterile conference room as I sat frozen in my chair, watching my parents hand my brother $15 million of our inheritance while dismissing me with empty platitudes. The air conditioning hummed overhead, but I felt hot with disbelief and growing rage. My name is Alina Hartwell, and I'm 27 years old. For the past 3 years, I've been working as a marketing coordinator at Sundale Financial in Portland, Oregon, slowly building my career while living in a cramped studio apartment. I'd always believed that hard work and determination would eventually pay off, that my parents valued my independence and strength. But sitting in that lawyer's office, watching my older brother Derek receive what should have been our shared inheritance, I realized how naive I'd been about my place in our family. The reading had started normally enough. Attorney Benjamin Walsh had called us all together to discuss my parents' updated will, explaining how they wanted to distribute their assets while they were still alive to see the benefits. My mother, Patricia, sat primly in her navy suit, her hands folded as she explained their decision. My father, Howard, nodded along, his expression serious but satisfied. "Derek has been struggling with his restaurant business," my mother said, her voice carrying that tone of maternal concern she reserved exclusively for my brother. "The pandemic hit him hard, and he needs this investment to get back on his feet. You understand, don't you, sweetheart?" I stared at her, my mouth dry. Derek's struggling restaurant was his third failed business venture in 5 years. Each time my parents had bailed him out, convinced that the next opportunity would be his breakthrough. Meanwhile, I'd paid my own way through college, worked 2 jobs to afford my tiny apartment, and never asked them for a single dollar. "What about my share?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. My father leaned forward, his expression gentle but firm. "Alina, you've always been so independent, so capable. Look at everything you've accomplished on your own. Derek needs guidance and support, but you're strong enough to make your own fortune." The words felt like a slap. Strong enough. As if my strength was a punishment. As if being responsible and self-reliant meant I deserved less love, less support, less consideration. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair beside me, but he didn't speak up. He never did when it came to defending me against our parents' obvious favoritism. As Attorney Walsh began explaining the technical details of the transfer, I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. This wasn't just about money. This was about a lifetime of being overlooked, of having my achievements minimized while Derek's failures were excused. Something was very wrong with this picture, and I could feel it in my bones that this wasn't the end of the story. Growing up, I'd always known I was different from Derek. Where he was charming and gregarious, I was quiet and studious. Where he took risks and dreamed big, I planned carefully and worked methodically toward my goals. Our parents had always treated these differences as complementary traits within our family dynamic, but now I understood they'd been keeping score all along. Derek was 31, 4 years older than me, and had been the golden child from birth. When he'd gotten mediocre grades in high school, my parents hired expensive tutors and celebrated when he barely graduated. When I earned a full academic scholarship to Portland State University, they'd smiled politely and reminded me to call home more often. The pattern had continued into adulthood. Derek's failed ventures were learning experiences, while my steady progress at Sundale Financial was simply expected. I thought about my grandmother, Alina Hartwell, who had passed away 6 months ago. She'd been the one person in our family who had truly seen me, who had encouraged my ambitions and celebrated my successes without reservation. While my parents fussed over Derek's latest crisis, Grandmother Elena would pull me aside and tell me how proud she was of my independence and work ethic. "Your strength is a gift, Alina," she used to say, her weathered hands holding mine. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." She'd lived with us during my teenage years, after grandfather passed away, and I'd spent countless hours listening to her stories about building a life through determination and smart choices. She'd been a successful businesswoman in her day, though she was always modest about her achievements. I'd assumed her wisdom and encouragement were her legacy to me, but sitting in that lawyer's office, I wondered if there was more. Attorney Walsh was still droning on about financial arrangements and tax implications when something nagged at the back of my mind. Grandmother Elena had been very particular about her affairs, very organized. She'd met with Attorney Walsh multiple times in the months before her death, often mentioning documents and arrangements she was updating. It seemed strange that someone so meticulous would leave everything to chance or to my parents' discretion. I glanced around the conference room, noting the way my parents avoided my eyes while Derek stared at his hands. The whole situation felt rehearsed, as if they'd discussed this scenario many times before. My mother kept checking her watch, and my father drummed his fingers against the polished table with barely concealed impatience. "Is that everything?" my mother asked, her voice bright with false cheer. "We have dinner reservations at 7. Attorney Walsh looked up from his documents, his expression thoughtful. "Actually, there is one more matter. I've been going through Elena's files more thoroughly, and there are some additional documents that require attention." Something shifted in the room's atmosphere. My parents exchanged a quick glance that I might have missed if I hadn't been watching them so carefully. Derek stopped fidgeting and looked up sharply. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet as Attorney Walsh reached for another folder on his desk. I felt my pulse quicken. Whatever was in that folder, my parents clearly hadn't expected it. Attorney Walsh opened the new folder with deliberate care, his movements precise and professional. "I need to apologize for the oversight, but Elena left specific instructions about timing that I'm only now fully understanding. She was quite insistent that certain documents not be revealed until after the initial reading." My mother's face had gone pale. "What kind of documents?" "It appears Elena created a separate trust fund years ago, one that she managed independently from the family estate." Attorney Walsh pulled out a thick manila envelope with my grandmother's distinctive handwriting across the front. "This envelope is specifically addressed to Elena, with instructions that it be opened only in my presence, and only after Patricia and Howard had made their intentions regarding the inheritance clear." My hands trembled as I reached for the envelope. The weight of it surprised me, thick with documents and what felt like additional items inside. My grandmother's handwriting was as elegant as I remembered, but there was an urgency to the way she'd written my name that made my heart race. "Elena was very specific about these instructions," Attorney Walsh continued, his voice gentle but firm. "She wanted Elena to understand the full scope of her legacy only after witnessing how the family inheritance was handled." Derek leaned forward in his chair. "What does that mean? What kind of trust?" My father cleared his throat, his discomfort obvious. "Elena never mentioned any separate arrangements to us. Are you certain this is legitimate?" The skepticism in his voice stung, but not as much as the fear I could see creeping into my parents' expressions. They knew something, I realized. Maybe not the details, but they suspected Grandmother Elena had made provisions they weren't aware of. With shaking fingers, I broke the wax seal on the envelope. Inside, I found multiple documents, bank statements, and a letter in my grandmother's handwriting. As I unfolded the letter, several items fell onto the conference table. Old photographs, jewelry I recognized from my childhood, and what appeared to be property deeds. The letter began with my grandmother's characteristic directness. "My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, then I suspect your parents have shown their true colors regarding the family inheritance. I have watched for years as they favored Derek while taking your strength and independence for granted. This ends now." My voice caught as I read the words aloud, but I continued. 25 years ago, I established a trust fund in your name, funded initially with money from my first business, and grown through careful investments over the decades. Additionally, I have left you my properties in Seattle, including the apartment building I purchased in 1995 and the commercial space downtown. The current value of these assets exceeds $8 million. The silence in the room was deafening. I looked up to see my parents staring at me with expressions of shock and something that looked like guilt. Derek's mouth hung open, his face flushed with confusion and what might have been anger. But I wasn't finished reading. There was more, and I could tell from the thickness of the remaining documents that my grandmother's surprises were just beginning. I continued reading my grandmother's letter, my voice growing stronger with each word. I have also documented every conversation I overheard regarding your parents' intentions for the family money. Patricia and Howard have been planning to exclude you from meaningful inheritance for over 2 years, believing that your independence meant you needed less support. They discussed this extensively during family dinners when they thought I was napping in my chair. The weight of betrayal settled on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. My parents had been planning this for years, discussing my financial future as if I were some burden to be managed rather than their daughter. Elena also left detailed financial records. Attorney Walsh interjected, spreading additional documents across the table. She tracked every time Patricia and Howard provided financial assistance to Derek over the past decade. The total exceeds $400,000 in gifts, loans, and investments that were never repaid. My father's face had turned red. Elena had no business keeping track of our private family matters. Actually, Attorney Walsh said calmly, she had every business tracking how her own contributions to the family were being distributed. It seems Elena provided significant financial support to your household over the years, money she expected would benefit both children equally. My grandmother's letter continued with devastating precision. Your parents have received nearly $2 million from me over the past 15 years. Money I gave them with the explicit understanding that it would secure both my grandchildren's futures. Instead, they have systematically funneled resources to Derek while convincing themselves that you required less because you were more capable. I looked up at my mother, who was staring at her hands. Is this true? Have you been taking money from grandmother and using it only for Derek? The silence stretched until my father finally spoke, his voice defensive. Elena was generous with our family, yes, but we used that money for household expenses, improvements, emergencies. Derek's business failures were not family emergencies, I said, my voice sharper than I'd ever used with my parents. His bad investments were not household expenses. Derek finally found his voice. Elena, you don't understand how difficult it's been. The restaurant industry is incredibly challenging, and I've been trying to build something meaningful. With my inheritance money, I shot back, with resources that should have been shared equally. Attorney Walsh cleared his throat. There's more in Elena's documentation. She hired a private investigator 6 months before her death to verify her suspicions about the family financial arrangements. He handed me a thick folder marked Confidential Investigation. Inside were photographs, bank records, and a detailed report tracking money flows within our family. The investigator had documented every check my parents had written to Derek, every business investment they'd made on his behalf, every debt they'd forgiven. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 5 years alone, Derek had received nearly $300,000 in direct support, not counting the money they were now giving him from the inheritance. Meanwhile, they'd contributed nothing to my education, my living expenses, or my career development. The investigator also discovered something interesting about Derek's current business situation, Attorney Walsh said, his tone carefully neutral. It appears his restaurant has been profitable for the past 18 months. The financial difficulties he described to your parents were exaggerated. I stared at my brother, watching his face cycle through several emotions before settling on resignation. Derek, is this true? It's complicated, he said, not meeting my eyes. There were some cash flow issues, and I needed capital for expansion. So, you lied to our parents about being in financial trouble? I didn't lie exactly. I just presented the worst-case scenario. The betrayal was complete now. Not only had my parents systematically favored Derek throughout our lives, but he had manipulated them into giving him money he didn't actually need. And they had been so eager to support him that they'd never questioned his claims. My grandmother's letter concluded with words that seemed to burn themselves into my memory. Elena, You are indeed strong enough to make your own way, but that strength should be celebrated, not punished. Use these resources to build the life you deserve, and remember that being independent doesn't mean you should be abandoned by those who claim to love you. I folded the letter carefully, my hands steadier now than they'd been in hours. The anger was still there, but it was crystallizing into something harder and more focused. My grandmother had given me more than money. She'd given me proof of everything I'd suspected about my place in this family. Attorney Walsh handed me additional documents from the envelope, including keys and property deeds. Elena also left specific instructions about how she wanted you to handle this information. She was quite strategic about the timing of these revelations. My grandmother had owned more property than I'd ever known about. The Seattle apartment building generated substantial rental income, and the commercial space downtown was leased to a thriving tech startup. But there was something else in the envelope that made my breath catch. Deed to a lake house in Bend that I'd never heard of, and financial records showing she'd been quietly investing in technology stocks for decades. The total value of Elena's independent assets is approximately $12 million, Attorney Walsh said. All of it has been left to you, along with detailed instructions for managing the properties and investments. My mother finally spoke, her voice thin and strained. Elena never told us about any of this. We had no idea she had so much money set aside. According to her notes, she tried to discuss her estate planning with you multiple times, Attorney Walsh replied. But you consistently told her not to worry about it, that you and Howard would handle everything fairly when the time came. I remembered those conversations now. Fragments of discussions I'd overheard between my parents and grandmother. They'd always dismissed her concerns about inheritance planning, assuring her they understood her wishes without ever asking what those wishes actually were. There's something else, Attorney Walsh continued, consulting his notes. Elena documented every major family event for the past decade, including conversations about Elena's achievements versus Derek's struggles. She was particularly troubled by your response to Elena's promotion last year. I'd been promoted to senior marketing coordinator at Sundale Financial 8 months ago, a significant achievement that had come with a substantial salary increase and expanded responsibilities. When I'd called to share the news, my mother had spent most of the conversation worrying about Derek's latest setback, instead of celebrating my success. Elena specifically noted that Patricia and Howard seemed more concerned about Derek's temporary difficulties than Elena's permanent advancement. Attorney Walsh read from my grandmother's file. She found this pattern deeply troubling and indicative of a fundamental unfairness in how they viewed their children's needs. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Look, I never asked them to give me more money than Elena. I just needed help when things got tough. But you knew they were giving you more, I said, my voice steady. You knew they'd always given you more, and you never once suggested that maybe I deserved equal support. You never seemed to need it, he said defensively. You were always so together, so successful on your own. That's exactly the problem, I said, standing up from my chair. Success shouldn't be punished. Being responsible shouldn't mean being ignored. The fact that I could handle things on my own doesn't mean I should have had to. My grandmother's file contained one more surprise. A letter addressed to my parents, sealed but with instructions that it be opened only if they contested the inheritance arrangements. Attorney Walsh held it up, his expression serious. Elena anticipated that Patricia and Howard might challenge these bequests, he said. She left this letter as her final word on the matter, along with instructions that if any legal challenges are made to Elena's inheritance, certain additional information would be made public. The threat was clear, even without opening the letter. My grandmother had protected her legacy to me with the same thoroughness she'd brought to everything else in her life. She'd anticipated my parents' potential objections and prepared accordingly. I looked around the room at my family, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. They weren't evil people, but they'd allowed their prejudices and assumptions to create a fundamental unfairness that had shaped my entire life. They'd convinced themselves that loving Derek more was somehow justified because I needed love less. But I was done accepting their version of fairness. The silence in the conference room stretched until my father finally spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. "What do you want from us, Alina?" The question hung in the air, loaded with decades of unspoken family dynamics. What did I want? An apology seemed insufficient. Acknowledgement of their favoritism felt too little, too late. The money my grandmother had left me changed everything, but it didn't erase the years of feeling like a second-class member of my own family. "I want honesty," I said finally. "I want you to admit that you've treated Derek and me differently our entire lives, and I want you to acknowledge that being independent doesn't mean I deserved less love or support." My mother's eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of genuine remorse or simply embarrassment at being caught. "We never meant to make you feel unloved, Alina. We were proud of your strength and independence. Being proud of my strength while punishing me for it are two different things," I replied. "You gave Derek every advantage, every safety net, every second chance. You gave me expectations and the assumption that I'd meet them without any help." Derek finally looked directly at me. "I'm sorry. I know this isn't fair, and I should have said something years ago." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because I was scared. I knew I wasn't as capable as you, and I was terrified of failing without their support. It was easier to let them keep helping me than to admit I should stand on my own." The honesty in his admission caught me off guard. I'd spent so many years resenting his advantages that I'd never considered the pressure he might have felt to live up to our parents' investments in him. Attorney Walsh gathered the documents on the table. "Alina, you'll need to make some decisions about how you want to proceed with your grandmother's legacy. The properties require active management, and there are some time-sensitive investment decisions to make." I thought about my cramped studio apartment, my modest salary at Sundale Financial, and the careful budgeting I'd done for years just to make ends meet. My grandmother's inheritance wouldn't just change my financial situation. It would completely transform my life's possibilities. "I'll need time to process all of this," I said. "But I want to make one thing clear. This doesn't repair our relationship. Trust isn't rebuilt with money or apologies. It's rebuilt with consistent actions over time." My father nodded slowly. "What would those actions look like?" "Start by being honest about Derek's situation. If his restaurant is profitable, stop treating him like a charity case. And start recognizing that independence is a strength, not a character flaw that disqualifies someone from family support." I stood up and gathered my grandmother's documents, feeling their weight both literally and figuratively. "I'm going to need some time to decide how I want to handle the properties and investments. Attorney Walsh, can we schedule a follow-up meeting next week?" "Of course. I'll also provide you with Elena's financial advisor's contact information. She worked with him for years to build these assets." As I prepared to leave, my mother reached out tentatively. "Alina, will you still come to Sunday dinner this week?" I looked at her, then at my father and Derek, seeing the hope and uncertainty in their faces. "I don't know yet. I need time to figure out who I am now that I know the truth about everything." Walking out of that conference room, I felt something I'd never experienced before: the weight of real choices. My grandmother had given me more than financial security. She'd given me the power to determine my own relationship with my family on my own terms. 3 weeks later, I sat in the passenger seat of my newly purchased car, a reliable Honda Civic that I'd bought with cash from my grandmother's trust, as I drove through the streets of Seattle to inspect my inherited properties. The apartment building was a beautiful brick structure in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, housing 12 units with a waiting list of potential tenants. The commercial space downtown was even more impressive, a renovated warehouse space that buzzed with the energy of the tech startup that leased it. But it wasn't the properties themselves that gave me the most satisfaction. It was the phone call I'd received that morning from Derek. "Alina, I need to talk to you," he'd said, his voice strained. "Mom and Dad are asking questions about the restaurant's finances, and they want to see actual books, not just my summaries. I'd smiled as I'd listened to him explain how our parents had finally started questioning his claims of financial difficulty. They'd hired an accountant to review his business records, the same way my grandmother had hired an investigator to verify her suspicions about our family dynamics. The truth has a way of coming out, I'd told him calmly. You spent years taking money you didn't need while they convinced themselves I didn't deserve support because I was too strong to need it. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents had always praised my independence while using it as an excuse to neglect me. Now that independence, backed by my grandmother's careful planning, had given me power they'd never anticipated. I pulled up in front of the commercial building and walked inside to meet with the tech startup's founders. They were eager to discuss expanding their lease, potentially doubling their footprint in the building. The monthly rent from just this one tenant would exceed my old salary at Sundale Financial. As I listened to their expansion plans, I thought about my grandmother's final gift. Not just the money and properties, but the knowledge of exactly where I stood in my family's priorities. She'd given me the tools to build a life completely independent of their approval or support. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Please come to dinner Sunday. We miss you. I read the message twice, feeling none of the old guilt or obligation that would have sent me rushing to accommodate them. Instead, I felt the quiet satisfaction of being wanted rather than expected, of having my presence requested rather than assumed. Sunday arrived, and I found myself standing on my parents' doorstep for the first time since the will reading. I'd spent the morning reviewing financial reports from my properties and meeting with my grandmother's investment advisor, who had explained the sophisticated portfolio she'd built over decades of careful planning. Alina, my mother said, opening the door with a bright smile that seemed forced. I'm so glad you came. The dining room felt different somehow, smaller than I remembered. Derek was already seated at the table, looking uncomfortable, while my father carved a roast at the head of the table. The scene was achingly familiar, yet everything had changed. How are the properties? My father asked as we began eating. Profitable, I said simply. Grandmother was an excellent investor. We had no idea Elena had accumulated so much wealth, my mother said, her tone carrying a hint of reproach. She always seemed so frugal. Being frugal is how you accumulate wealth, I replied. She understood the difference between spending money and investing it. Derek cleared his throat. I wanted to tell you both something. I've decided to pay back the money you gave me from the inheritance. My parents exchanged shocked glances. Derek, that's not necessary, my father said quickly. That money was a gift. No, it wasn't, Derek said firmly. It was Alina's inheritance that you gave to me instead. She deserves her fair share, and I don't actually need it for the restaurant. I watched my parents process this information, seeing them grapple with the reality of their favoritism for perhaps the first time. They'd spent so many years justifying their differential treatment that facing the truth was clearly difficult. I appreciate the gesture, I told Derek, but keep the money. Use it to expand the restaurant properly, without lying about your financial situation. What I want is honesty about how our family actually works. My mother set down her fork. What do you mean? I mean acknowledging that you've always treated us differently, and making conscious choices about whether you want to continue doing that. The conversation continued through dessert, tense but necessary, as we began the long process of rebuilding our family relationships on a foundation of truth, rather than assumptions and favoritism. In the months that followed, Derek's restaurant empire crumbled under the weight of his own deceptions. When our parents hired an accountant to review his books, they discovered he'd been inflating his expenses and deflating his income for years to justify their financial support. The revelation shattered their trust in him completely, and they stopped providing the safety net he'd relied on for so long. Without their constant bailouts, Derek was forced to confront his poor business decisions and lack of financial discipline. His restaurant ultimately failed, not because of market conditions, but because he'd never learned to operate responsibly. He was forced to move back in with our parents, working as a line cook at someone else's restaurant while slowly paying back his debts. Our parents, meanwhile, faced the consequences of their decades of favoritism. The family relationships they'd taken for granted were permanently altered, and they struggled to understand how their protective treatment of Derek had actually weakened him, while their challenging treatment of me had been a form of neglect. They attended family therapy sessions, trying to understand the damage their unconscious biases had caused. But the trust that had been broken would take years to rebuild. As for me, I used my grandmother's legacy to build something meaningful, not just wealth, but a life defined by my own choices, rather than other people's expectations. I left Sundale Financial to manage my properties full-time, expanding my real estate portfolio and supporting other young women starting their own businesses. My grandmother had been right. Strength should be celebrated, not punished. Looking back on those pivotal weeks, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't financial success or family drama. It was living authentically and refusing to accept less than I deserved, even from people who claimed to love me.